Well, greetings everyone. Welcome to this third video in the series on the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation. If you don't remember, or if it's been a bit of time since the first and second episode, just by way of quick summary, in the first episode we looked at the first 11 verses of chapter 1 and looked for clues as to how to read this document, how to read the Revelation. And we noted that there were signs that it was an apocalypse, that it was an apocalyptic material, that it was a prophecy, and that, number 3, it was an epistle. And then in the second video of this series, we unpacked those genres a little bit. What does it mean that it's an apocalypse? What does it mean that it's prophetic? What does it mean that it's an epistle? We looked at the ad hoc nature of some of those things, that they are occasioned by certain circumstances, and so that brings us to the third video now, and we're going to talk about some of these basic questions: who, when, and why. Who wrote it? When was it written? And why was it written? The authorship question, the date question, and then some questions about the occasion. What gave rise to the writing? So first, to begin, let's deal with the authorship question. Now, I wouldn't say that this is a really pressing issue, that it really matters a whole lot who wrote it. For some, especially for early church fathers and things like this, apostolic authority meant a lot. But I think the importance, it's more important is what was written and why it was written, I think. So the question of who and when the question of when it was written begins to play into a little bit of the circumstance, and so it contributes a little bit to the occasion. So when matters a little bit, who maybe not so much. Nevertheless, it's a matter of interest and curiosity, and people want to know. And the earliest tradition, that is the tradition that we can trace back the furthest, states that the John of the Revelation, the John of the Apocalypse, is John the son of Zebedee, John the Galilean fisherman, John the disciple of Jesus. So in short, that is the Apostle John, St. John the Apostle. And the earliest record we have of this, the earliest extra biblical evidence of this, comes from Justin Martyr in 155 CE. He was an early Christian apologist. That is, he was a defender of the faith, and in his work, The Dialogue with Trypho, he identifies the author of the Apocalypse as John the Apostle. Now, this is pretty good evidence, I think. It's early, but given the fact that he is a Christian apologist and he's defending some point in this dialogue with Trypho, and he's using Revelation. At one point he's using Revelation to defend his point. It becomes for him important, I think. It helps his case that the apocalypse, the Revelation, has apostolic authority. And so John may have had a bit of a dog in this fight. Now, far be it from me, far be it from Rick Fletcher to cast aspersions on St. Justin the Martyr, saying that he passed on bad information. Heaven forbid that I should say that, so I'll just imply it, perhaps, and move on from there. That maybe that maybe Justin had a dog in this fight, that maybe it was to his benefit in his argument that he was arguing using a text that had apostolic authority, and so that may have been why he went that route. Nevertheless, it's still early evidence and testimony that John the Apostle was the author. The second external evidence to this is Irenaeus in 180, and even though it's a later date, but it's perhaps more compelling. That is, it's perhaps more persuasive evidence, because he was really only 1 degree of separation away from John the Apostle. Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, And Polycarp was a student of John the Apostle. Polycarp, who later became a bishop in one of the cities in Asia Minor. And so, one degree of separation from John the Apostle, really. So this is later, 25 years later, but it's perhaps more compelling evidence than Justin Martyr. Now, in terms of current scholastic opinion, what does current scholarship say? They've looked pretty carefully at this. And most current scholarship says that, given the fact that there is nothing in the text itself, nothing in the document itself, that suggests any connection between the author of the Revelation and the apostle by that same name. So there's nothing in the text that says those two are the same person. And David Aune, the author of the 3-volume commentary on the Revelation in the Word Biblical series of commentaries, this is perhaps one of the top 3, perhaps I would say, commentaries on the Revelation. It is sort of a definitive work on the Revelation. He says this in his commentary: by the end of the 19th century, there was nearly unanimous support. So end of the 19th century, so we're the late 1800s, nearly unanimous agreement among critical scholars that the author of the Revelation and the author of the Gospel of John could not be the same person. And they're looking at all kinds of linguistic and stylistic things, the diction used by both, what kind of words were they using, what kind of sentence structure did they have, and so on. And they're concluding that these are not the same writers. Now, one of the words in here that people often get tripped up by is agreement among critical scholars. And too often, people hear the word critical and think of negative things. Criticism, negative criticism, everything. We have this association of critical, this negative association of the word critical and criticism and critic. And that's just wrong. We shouldn't be thinking that way. We should all be critical. We should all be doing criticism. We should all be critics, because this comes from the Greek word kritikos, which means able to judge. That's what it means to be critical, able to judge. And so critical, in terms of critical scholarship, means you're bringing all kinds of evidence, you're gathering all kinds of evidence, and you're making a judgment, you're reviewing that evidence and making a judgment based on the evidence that you gather. So critical really just means evidence-based judgment. And that's why we should be doing this. That's why it's good to be a critical thinker. We need to, if we have a problem, we need to gather all kinds of evidence that bears on that problem, look at it all, review it all, weigh it all, and then make an informed, educated, evidence-based decision. That's what critical thinking is. It's informed thinking. So we shouldn't be thinking of critical negatively. I try and tell my students that. I try and get them away from this association of critical with negative things. So that's the scholastic opinion on the authorship question. So then, if it doesn't look like, maybe it's not John the Apostle, what can we know about this author? What can we sort of be sure of? Well, the author tells us 4 times in the document that his name is John. He identifies himself as John. 3 times in the first chapter and once again in the final chapter. But ultimately, this doesn't reveal a whole lot to us. All it tells us is that he has a Jewish name and so is likely Jewish. So we don't get very far just by knowing his name. There were lots of Johns in the ancient world. Internal evidence, that is, what can we know from the document itself? Internal evidence suggests that the author was well known to the recipients of his letter. The churches to whom he was writing, the congregations to whom he was writing, seemed to know him and he knew them. We can see this in the letter itself. And so this is some more of what the evidence on the inside suggests. Evidence suggests that the author was probably a Palestinian Jew. So how do we arrive at that? Well, here's some of the evidence that leads us to that conclusion. The author had an impressive familiarity with the Old Testament, both in its Hebrew form and its Greek form. The abbreviation at the end there, the Hebrew text and Greek text, and then it says LXX. That's the abbreviation for the Septuagint, which means the 70. And that's the abbreviation that is used for the earliest extant, the earliest in existence Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And it was called the Septuagint. There's a lot of sort of ancient lore surrounding, legends surrounding how this document came into existence. It was Ptolemy II that commissioned it. And there's legend that 70 scholars, and in some cases the legend is 72 scholars, because some have adjusted the legend to say, well, there were 6 scholars from each tribe of Israel that were sort of commissioned to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And so they all went away and translated it and all came back, and they all had exactly the same translation, which testifies to the fact that this is an inspired translation. And anyway, there's all kinds of lore around it, and that's where the title, the 70, the Septuagint, comes from. So if you see LXX through documents, they're referring to the Hebrew scriptures in Greek, and that's the oldest version we have. So our author, we see all through the document that our author John is quoting, often directly from the Septuagint, like word for word in many instances, quoting from the Hebrew Old Testament, the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. He relies heavily on Daniel and Ezekiel. Those are 2 of his favorite sources, and quotes from them a lot. So we suggest he's a Palestinian Jew because of his impressive familiarity with the Old Testament. His use of the apocalyptic genre itself speaks a little bit to this, because the apocalyptic genre was most at home in this early Palestinian Judaic setting. Palestinian Judaism really gave rise to most of the apocalyptic literature we have. And so that also speaks to the fact that he was probably a Palestinian Jew. In terms of familiarity, the author is really familiar with the temple in Jerusalem, and the temple practices in Jerusalem. And several of the texts, several parts of the apocalypse focus on Palestine, on the geography, the region, Palestine, Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem. There's a number of pieces in the document itself that make reference to these things. And finally, the document itself has a very distinctive Semitic style, suggesting that our author is not a native Greek speaker, but you can see a Semitic influence in his writing. And so, based on all these things, based on all the evidence we have, the supposition is that likely our author is a Palestinian Jew who was a refugee from Jerusalem, from Palestine, in the aftermath of the first Jewish revolt, somewhere in the 66 to 73 time during that Jewish revolt, that he left Palestine and traveled and finally ended up likely in Asia Minor, where this document originates. Now, in terms of how the author thinks of himself and the role that he believes he's playing, the author never explicitly states that he is a prophet, but the fact that he specifically designates the text that he is writing as a prophecy makes this implication pretty clear. It's pretty hard to write prophecy if you are not a prophet. And so the fact that he calls his text a prophecy makes it pretty clear, the implication is pretty clear, that he thinks of himself as a prophet. And if you look at chapter 22, verse 9, when he talks about the prophets and the role of the prophets in this area, and that he's kind of associating himself with this, that makes it pretty clear. It's quite likely that he had a regular prophetic role among the congregations to whom he's writing. These various churches. He probably was an itinerant prophet or an itinerant preacher who traveled from church to church, city to city. We have lists of cities, and he probably made the rounds of these cities and spoke to these congregations, and that's why. We can surmise that from his familiarity with their situations, and we'll see more of that when we get to chapters 2 and 3. And look at the oracles to these churches specifically. So he was probably a Palestinian Jew, a refugee from Palestine, living in Asia Minor, and is functioning in the role of a prophet, preacher among these various churches in Asia Minor. Okay, the next thing we want to consider is the when, the date of this, of the apocalypse. When was it written? During what period of time was the apocalypse written? And in this case, when we come to dating the apocalypse, scholars fall into kind of two camps. There are two sides to this issue, or they support two different ideas about when the apocalypse was written. The first camp is that it was written towards the end of the reign of Emperor Domitian, and Domitian's reign was from 81 to 96 CE. And so people say, well, it was probably towards the end of the reign of Domitian. It was probably in around 95 CE. So that's one camp. And the other camp is that it was written between 64 and 70. In 64, this is in response to the persecutions of Nero, the persecution of Christians under Nero. And then by 70, that was the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, by Vespasian and Titus when they sacked Jerusalem. And that it was written in between those periods, sometimes in those periods, between the persecution of Nero and the destruction of the temple. Now, again, currently, in terms of current scholarship, the prevailing scholastic opinion is that Revelation was written, it's this first camp, that Revelation was written during near the end of the reign of Emperor Domitian, around 95. And the evidence for that, and I'll provide you with some of the evidence for that, for this current scholastic belief that it was around 95. And the evidence is, well, we'll look at some internal evidence first, that is evidence from within the document itself. The first piece of evidence for a 95 date is John, our author's, use of the Nero Redivivus legend. Nero Redivivus. And Nero Redivivus is Latin phrase, which sort of is the title of a legend regarding Nero's return, or Nero come back to life again, Nero revived, that kind of idea. They believed that Nero maybe was dead but would come back to life again, or that he wasn't really dead and he was coming back to reign over a new Roman Empire again, Nero reborn. But mostly it refers to a Nero come back to life again. And so if it's Nero come back to life, it means it's post-Nero, it's after Nero's death. So that's the first bit of evidence in terms of time period, the 95. It's post-Nero. The second piece of evidence for this date is the reference to, or the use of, Babylon as a metaphor for Rome, calling Rome Babylon. And this is because of the destruction of the temple in 70 under Vespasian and Titus, when they took control of the empire after Nero's death. And it was Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar that destroyed Solomon's temple, the first temple, and now since Rome has destroyed the second temple, it makes sense to refer to Rome as Babylon because they were the ones that did it the first time. So this metaphorical designation of Rome as Babylon because of the destruction of the first temple at the hands of the Babylonians. Finally, more internal evidence is the use of the phrase in the document, Hoidodeca Apostoloi, the 12 apostles. This phrase, Hoidodeca Apostoloi, is not earlier. The earliest evidence we have for that phrase is 80 CE. 80. That's the first time it was used in writing, and that there were specifically 12 apostles, that kind of idea. The phrase, the 12 apostles, doesn't appear anywhere earlier than 80. So if it's being used in this document, it's got to be 80 or later. And then a piece of external evidence that we have is the testimony of Irenaeus again. Irenaeus from 180. He says specifically, when he attributes it to John the Apostle, But he says specifically that it appeared at the end of the reign of Domitian. So there we go. It's interesting that some scholars say, well, we'll accept this testimony, but when he says that it was written by John the Apostle, we won't accept that testimony. It's kind of interesting that they take part of what he says as truth and the other part not. So make of that what you will. Finally, we come to what is by far the most important question that we're going to be asking is, why was it written? That is, what was the occasion? What was the exigence? What gave rise to, or what was it that gave rise to John writing? What made him write? And of the questions we're asking, this is certainly the most significant. This is an important one, because what we're really asking is, what is John's purpose? So if we're asking why did he write, what was his purpose in writing? What did he want? What did John want by writing to these churches? What motivated John to write, and what does he hope to achieve by writing to these churches? These are huge questions, and these are ultimately going to be the focus of our investigations. To understand what he's writing, we need to really know why he's writing and what he hopes to get. And as this is really just a simplified introduction, this is a simplified introduction to a very complex question. So we could go a lot deeper into this question than we are going to go, but time just doesn't allow us to get any further than what we're going to do. So I'm going to try and make this as simple an introduction as I can to a very complex issue. So the way I tell my students about this, or the way I try and help my students to understand this, is as though this were a TV expose, a news expose. John, I say, is a little bit like an investigative reporter. And the revelation, the document that he is writing, is a little bit like an expose. John, in his prophetic awareness, exposes, or hopes to expose for his audience the truth about the society in which they live, namely the Roman Empire. He wants to peel the cover off, reveal what kind of a society they live in. So John's purpose is to really open the eyes, right? He wants to peel back the layers of the Roman Empire and open the eyes of his audience. Open the eyes of Christians in the Roman province of Asia about their choices, the kinds of choices they're making, their allegiances, and their values. And these are important things. And these are things that all Christians should be asking themselves. On what basis are we making our choices in life? Who do we owe allegiance to? And what does our value system look like? This is some pretty important self-reflection for any Christian, I think. So the revelation is a prophecy specifically for the situation of the churches of the province of Asia. We talked about this before when we talked about apocalyptic, prophetic, and epistles, that all of them are ad hoc. They're to a specific situation. And that situation is the churches of the province of Asia, not us. Right? John is not writing to us. John doesn't know anything about us. And we can make use of his writing, absolutely. But that's the last step we should get to, not the first step. And in trying to understand the apocalypse, trying to understand the text, it's important for us to understand that situation first. What was going on for the churches of Asia? Because John was writing a prophecy specifically for them in their situation. So he's writing a prophecy specifically for the churches of Asia and calling for the churches to respond to the Spirit. Right? Those who have ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches, he says over and over again. Right? He calls for the churches to respond to the Spirit, to be a countercultural alternative, that they should be something different in the Roman world. In the midst of the Roman Empire, people should be able to look at the Christian community and see something different values, different choices, different allegiances from what they see around them. They should be making different choices that are different from the society. hold allegiances that are different than the society, and embrace different values from the society around them. The community of Christians should and must look very different from the society of the Roman Empire. But we have to remember that we're talking about a community, a smaller community in a larger society. And this is what is so troubling and makes it all so difficult. So again, as a prophet, John is looking around at his current situation, looking around at present situations, and foreseeing likely future conditions. He looks around, sees what's going on, and then foresees where all of this is heading. And through this, because he's doing this, looking at the present conditions, predicting future conditions, he delivers a word from the Lord to, first of all, to support the community's counter definition of the cosmic order. And we'll talk about what the Christian community's definition of the cosmic order is. It should be pretty clear. So he's delivering a word from the Lord to support that community's counter definition and outlining a program of survival for the community in the face of pressure from the society. Right? The small community in the larger society is going to present considerable pressure to the smaller community. And so how do you survive as a small community in a large society that is creating quite a considerable amount of pressure, societal pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, religious pressure, all these kind of things on that community? How do you survive? So again, as a prophet, John has read the signs of his time, and he understands, he understood the approaching conflict between the Christian community and the political and social forces of the empire. John sees that the Christian community holds different values, allegiances, makes different choices than the society at large, and that those differences are going to come into serious conflict. That the empire and the community of Christians are headed for a conflict over those allegiances and values. So, this conflict, what does this conflict look like? The conflict that John sees coming, well, the ruler or emperor, in this case, when we're talking specifically about the Roman Empire, the ruler, the emperor, speaks for the gods or is a god. Now, this should sound familiar if you watched Paul Thiel's series on Genesis, because in the ancient Near East, this was the same kind of thing. This is the same kind of thing that Paul was talking about when he went through his Genesis series. The Near Eastern rulers and despots and things like that held this same. There was this same kind of value system in those kingdoms, that the king speaks for the gods or is a god himself. And no different in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire embodied this principle that the emperor spoke for the gods or was a god. They embodied this principle through the imperial cult, which was a political institution expressed in a religious form. And we're going to see more about that when we dive into the text. A political institution expressed in a religious form. And herein lies the conflict. This is where the community is really going to come into conflict with the society. The Christian community espouses a completely different set of meanings that deny the object of the society. This community is contrary in its objectives to the society. The community and the society are very different here. Namely, the community espouses the values that Jesus is Lord and Savior. Jesus is Kurios Kai Soter, not Caesar. Not Caesar. And this puts the community into direct conflict with the society in which it exists. The society in which it exists says the emperor speaks for the god or is a god, especially Domitian. When we look at the character of Domitian himself, I'll try and find some documents. Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, makes a reference to this. But Domitian thought pretty highly of himself, put himself on the level of a god, And the Christian community, and John especially as a prophet, sees that there's going to be a conflict here over who is Lord and Savior, who is really in control of the universe. Okay, and I mean, this idea that Jesus is Lord, that sounds like, to us, this is the kind of thing that you see maybe as a nice banner or a plaque on a wall in a church. I remember the church that I grew up had a nice Jesus is Lord as a plaque on the front of the church. And growing up, I thought, well, that's nice. Yeah, I can fully go along with that. But this is the kind of profession, if this is a statement that you're making at this time in the first century, that's the kind of thing that gets you killed. That's the kind of thing that marks you out and identifies you as a bad citizen of the Roman Empire, that you're not going along with the society, you're not going along with the values and objectives of the society. In fact, you're in direct conflict with the society over that. And so this was a radical and dangerous statement to say Jesus is Lord and Savior. All right. This conflict, the Holy War, John casts this coming conflict, the conflict that he sees coming, he casts this in terms of a battle, a war. He uses the language of warfare all the time. The language of warfare is a dominant motif in the Apocalypse of John, especially in the repeated calls to his churches to be conquerors. And we're going to see that repeated in every oracle to the churches. Each of the churches is called to conquer. To those who conquer, and then some promise is made. So they're called to be conquerors. Now, this idea of a conqueror this conquest. This comes from the Greek verb nikao, which and even then, was so frequently associated with victory in athletic competitions. You get the laurel wreath of victory if you won, wrestling or whatever it happened to be. But first and foremost, nikao, this kind of victory, has to do with military conquest, military victory. Nike, it's not just a pair of running shoes. Nike was the goddess, and you can see statuary, all kinds of statuary of Nike, winged victory, and that was the goddess to whom they sacrificed in hopes of military conquest, military victory. Might interest you to know that Nike, the goddess Nike, the Latin equivalent of Nike was Victoria. I mean, we're living in the town named after her. Well, Queen Victoria, really, but she was named after the Latin equivalent of Nike, the goddess of victory. So this is an important verb, and we're going to see it a lot in the Revelation. In fact, nikao, the verb victory, to conquer, and its related forms, is used 28 times in all in the New Testament. 17 of those appearances are in the Revelation. And that demands our attention. When we see that heavy a use of one specific word like that, we need to really pay attention to it and translate it correctly, because I think it gets diminished too often in some translations. To those we see, instead of to those who conquer, or to those who are victorious, we see to those who overcome. And I think that the connotations of that take us too far away from the military associations and the holy war associations that John intends with that word. He really wants to communicate the idea and continue the motif of warfare and battle. And he uses that word, I think, very purposefully. And we got to be careful to translate it with what we think John's intentions were for the connotations of that word. So, some summary. The occasion then, or the exigence, or the reason that John wrote the Revelation, is that he sees a coming collision, a conflict, a war. And at issue, the importance at issue are the questions of sovereignty. Who really is in control of the universe? Caesar or Jesus? Is Jesus Lord and Savior, or is Caesar Lord and Savior? So, sovereignty, who really is in control of the universe, and allegiance. Which side are we on? And John is really concerned for his churches, for those congregations in Asia Minor, to make sure that they understand where their allegiance lies. Who do they say is really in control? And is that where they are putting their allegiance? Do their values show that? Do their choices show that? Do their allegiances show that? Are they siding with Christ? Well, I think for John, he looks at his churches and thinks maybe some are and maybe some are not, right? And so for him, this is a really serious matter. This is an important document. He is legitimately worried that some of his congregations too easily could say, oh, Caesar, yes, oh, I know he's not really king of the universe, but for economic reasons, to keep my job perhaps, or some other societal pressures, that the community is being squeezed by the society, and it's just convenient to say, yeah, sure, Caesar is Lord and Savior. I know he's not, and John says, no, you can't do that. You've got to pick a side. You've got to declare yourself. And he thinks, I think he thinks that some of these churches have not got this sorted out. They're not sure where their allegiance lies, who their sovereign is. And so this is an important situation for John. So that's kind of a quick and as simple as I can make it summary of the exigence or the occasion, the reason that John is writing. Thanks for spending your time, and please join me in episode 4.